When Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus took the throne, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. They didn't fear him. They celebrated him. After the grim, paranoid years under Emperor Tiberius, this new ruler seemed like a miracle. He was young, generous, and full of life. For days, the streets erupted in joy. Here was the son of Germanicus, their beloved general, a man they believed carried heroism in his veins. This legacy alone convinced the people that a golden age was dawning. In those first months, everything he did fueled their hope. He slashed taxes, freed political prisoners, and brought lavish games back to the Colosseum. Rome adored him. They saw a charismatic leader, the opposite of a tyrant. But beneath that charming surface was a man forged in tragedy. He had watched politics destroy his family, learning early that survival required a performance. Now, as emperor, the applause and obedience taught him a dangerous lesson, that an adoring empire would accept anything. The hope Rome felt was a beautiful, fragile thing, and it was about to be broken. Advisors learned to speak carefully. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, slowly, disguised as loyalty. Then came the illness. Late in his first year, he was struck by a violent sickness that nearly killed him. For weeks, Rome held its breath. Temples overflowed with prayers, and promises were made to the gods in exchange for his life. When he survived, the city rejoiced again, but those closest to him noticed a change. His eyes no longer searched for approval. His words no longer invited debate. He spoke of destiny, of divine favor, and of Rome as something that belonged to him completely. What returned from that sickness was not the smiling savior the people had crowned, but a ruler who believed that limits were illusions. This was the beginning, not of sudden madness, but of a system. A belief took root that power existed to test obedience, to expose weakness, and to turn private lives into instruments of control. And the man Rome had loved was quietly preparing to show the empire what unconditional power truly meant. Subscribe for more. After the sickness released him, Rome noticed the silence before it noticed the fear. The emperor who once laughed easily now watched more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried a strange certainty that unsettled even loyal men. Court physicians whispered that his fever had burned too long, that something fragile inside him had been altered. He dismissed them with a glance. He no longer believed in weakness, least of all his own. The nights became his domain. While the city slept, he wandered the palace halls barefoot on cold marble, stopping before statues as if listening for replies. Servants reported finding him awake until dawn, eyes wide, unmoving, murmuring to the moon, and arguing with shadows that no one else could see. He began to speak of gods not as distant beings, but as rivals who had finally recognized him. Soon, belief turned into command. He ordered that the heads of Rome's gods be replaced with his own likeness, not as a joke, but as a correction. To question this was to question the natural order, and questioning the natural order was treason. Senators learned to nod, priests learned to adapt their prayers, and artists learned to sculpt faster than conscience allowed. What had once been devotion to tradition became devotion to survival. A illness had not made him weak. It had stripped away the last reason he felt to pretend restraint mattered. His body changed as well, becoming part of the performance. He dressed in divine costumes during private rituals, sometimes appearing as different gods on different nights, demanding specific offerings and ceremonies. These were not public spectacles yet. They were rehearsals. Inside sealed chambers, select nobles were summoned to witness him speak as a living deity, testing how far reverence could be forced without resistance. Some laughed nervously, believing it was theater. Others trembled, sensing something deeper and far more dangerous. Every reaction was remembered. What frightened Rome's inner circle most was how deliberate it all felt. This was not chaos. Schedules were written. Invitations were precise. Punishments were measured. When someone displeased him, the response was rarely immediate. He waited. He watched. Then he struck in a way that made the lesson unforgettable. The palace became a place where nothing felt accidental. Even kindness carried weight, because it could be withdrawn without warning. During this time, he began speaking openly about purity, honor, and ownership, but his definitions twisted these ideas into tools. To him, honor was obedience. Purity was something that existed to be tested. Ownership extended beyond land and law into bodies, families, and futures. He spoke of Rome as a living organism that needed to be shaped, corrected, and disciplined. Many believed he was preparing reforms. They did not yet understand he was preparing submission. By the end of that year, those closest to him realized the truth too late. The illness had not created a monster overnight. It had removed the final barrier between thought and action. The smiling savior was gone, replaced by a ruler convinced that suffering was not a crime, but a proof of authority. And with that belief firmly set, the next step was inevitable. What had been tested in private chambers would soon become policy, and Rome would learn that survival now depended on how much humiliation it was willing to endure in silence. The first lines crossed were not drawn around strangers, but around blood. Long before the terror reached Rome's elite, it settled quietly inside the imperial household, where power had no witnesses and obedience was expected without explanation. The emperor began to blur the meaning of family, speaking of his sisters not as relatives, but as extensions of himself, symbols of purity that belonged to the throne rather than to private life. Among them, Drusilla stood apart. He elevated her presence at public events, seated her where only empresses belonged, and allowed rumors to circulate without denial. In Rome, silence from the emperor was never neutrality. It was instruction. The court learned quickly that acknowledging this distortion was safer than questioning it. What looked like affection was in truth possession, and possession was the language he was teaching everyone to speak. When Drusilla died suddenly, the city expected mourning. What it received was command. The emperor ordered a level of grief so extreme it bordered on ritual punishment. Laughter became illegal. Public joy was treated as an insult. Even bathing and family meals were restricted, turning daily life into a test of loyalty. Executions followed, not because of rebellion, but because someone smiled at the wrong moment or failed to appear sufficiently broken. His grief was not sorrow for a sister, but rage at losing something he believed was his by right. Death, in his mind, had stolen property. That belief hardened into doctrine, and from that moment forward, intimacy itself became a resource to be controlled. With Drusilla gone, his attention shifted to the remaining women of his family, including Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. They were drawn into a world where affection and fear could no longer be separated. Their proximity to power made them both privileged and vulnerable, living symbols of how far authority could reach when no moral boundary was recognized. What happened within the household set a precedent. If blood ties offered no protection, then no law, no tradition, and no title could claim to limit the emperor's will. The palace became a laboratory where obedience was tested at the most personal level before being applied to the empire at large. This was the moment the system took shape. Family was reduced to function, and function was measured by usefulness. The emperor had learned something essential. Humiliation was more effective than execution. A dead enemy was silent, but a living, broken one became an example. By first asserting control over those closest to him, he demonstrated that resistance was meaningless, even in the most sacred spaces. Rome did not yet see the pattern clearly, but the lesson was already complete. What began as a private corruption would soon expand outward, transforming noble households into extensions of the palace. And as the walls between public authority and private life collapsed, the empire moved one step closer to a reality where dignity itself could be ordered, priced, and taken away on command. What had once been the heart of Roman governance quietly transformed into something colder, and far more deliberate. The imperial palace was no longer merely a residence or a seat of power. It became an instrument designed to produce obedience through ritualized humiliation. Rooms were renamed, corridors repurposed, and schedules enforced with the precision of a military campaign. Nothing inside those marble walls was accidental anymore. Senators who entered expecting discussion found themselves navigating silence, instructed where to stand, when to speak, and when to lower their eyes. The palace itself taught them the rules before the emperor ever appeared. Fear was embedded in architecture, and authority was reinforced by routine. Private chambers were redesigned into symbolic spaces, each carrying a specific function. One room was styled as a place of divine judgment, where the emperor presented himself not as a ruler, but as a living god dispensing favor or punishment. Another was staged to mimic sacred myths, forcing participants to reenact stories they had once only whispered about in temples. These were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were rehearsed, repeated, and documented. Servants recorded attendance. Officials tracked compliance. What occurred inside these rooms was treated as state business, processed with the same seriousness as taxation or military supply. The message was unmistakable. Personal dignity was now a matter of imperial policy. The most devastating aspect was how participation was framed as honor. Noble families were told their involvement proved loyalty to Rome itself. Refusal was never openly punished at first. Instead, those who hesitated found doors closing around them. Legal protections disappeared. Financial audits began. Sons were reassigned to distant posts and never returned the same. Daughters were suddenly summoned for instruction under the language of tradition and duty. By the time punishment arrived, it felt almost justified, as if resistance itself were the crime. The palace did not need chains. It used expectation, fear, and gradual isolation to break those who entered. Inside this system, humiliation became currency. Every reaction was measured. Who endured silently? Who begged? Who tried to reason? These details were remembered and later exploited. The emperor observed not only bodies, but souls, cataloging weakness and compliance with unsettling patience. Rome's elite learned that survival depended not on virtue or service, but on how convincingly one could surrender dignity. The palace corridors echoed with controlled footsteps, whispered warnings, and the knowledge that walls themselves were listening. By the time rumors reached the wider city, they sounded too organized to be dismissed and too structured to be denied. This was no longer the indulgence of a single man. It was a system that required participation to function and silence to survive. The palace had become a machine, and Rome was feeding it piece by piece. What had been tested on a few families was ready to expand. The question was no longer whether the empire would resist, but how much of itself it would give away before realizing there was nothing left to protect. By the time the system reached full force, Rome's nobility understood a brutal truth. Survival now had a price, and that price was paid in silence and submission. What had begun inside the palace spilled outward into the private lives of senators, knights, and wealthy families who once believed their status offered protection. Invitations arrived, sealed with imperial authority, written in language that sounded ceremonial but carried an unspoken threat. Attendance was not optional. Absence was remembered. Inside controlled halls, dignity was measured, evaluated, and quietly stripped away, not through chaos, but through rules that felt disturbingly official. The empire that once prided itself on law had learned to weaponize procedure. Fathers were placed in impossible positions, forced to choose between obedience and destruction. They were told participation proved loyalty, while refusal endangered entire households. Husbands were compelled to witness humiliation disguised as ritual, expected to applaud devotion to the state, while their own honor was dismantled in front of them. The cruelty was not only in the act itself, but in the performance of consent. Smiles were required. Gratitude was expected. Those who failed to perform convincingly found their fortunes audited, their allies arrested, their children reassigned into dangerous service. Rome's elite learned that dignity could be taxed, negotiated, and confiscated like property. What made the system truly devastating was its precision. Rates were standardized, fees were recorded, payments flowed directly into the imperial treasury under names that suggested voluntary contribution and civic duty. There was no hiding from the paperwork. Suffering was reduced to entries in ledgers, processed with the same indifference as grain shipments or road repairs. This transformed personal violation into something even darker, an accepted function of governance. The emperor did not need to threaten openly. The structure itself enforced compliance, turning victims into unwilling participants in their own destruction. Rumors spread through the city, but fear kept them fragmented. Each family believed their ordeal was isolated, a private disgrace best concealed. That isolation was intentional. It prevented unity, ensuring no one realized how widespread the abuse had become. Even the courts remained silent, because judges were not exempt. The same rules applied to them, binding the guardians of law to the machinery of humiliation. Rome's moral center did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded quietly as each household chose survival over resistance, hoping the nightmare would stop with them. By now, the emperor no longer needed to watch every ritual. The system sustained itself. Officials enforced schedules. Servants prepared chambers. Nobles arrived already defeated, knowing resistance only worsened the outcome. The greatest empire of the ancient world had reached a point where honor was no longer defended, only prized. And as Rome continued to function, trade continued, and festivals continued. A terrifying realization settled in. The system endured because it worked. And once an empire learns it can rule through organized humiliation, the final boundary is already gone. The end did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a sudden awakening of conscience, but with exhaustion and fear quietly reaching their limit. By the time the emperor's rule began to fracture, the damage was already complete. Rome had adapted to the unthinkable. What once would have caused revolt had become routine, absorbed into daily life through habit and terror. People learned which streets to avoid, which names not to speak, and which memories to bury. The system did not collapse because it was exposed. It collapsed because power shifted, and the man who had built it lost the protection of absolute control. When conspirators finally moved against him, they did not act in the name of justice. They acted in the name of survival, fearing they would be next in a machine that no longer required reason to destroy. After his death, the Senate rushed to erase him. Statues were pulled down. Names were scratched from inscriptions. Official records were rewritten or quietly destroyed. This was not done to protect morality, but to protect Rome's image. The empire needed to believe the horror had been the work of one man, not a structure that thousands had served. Blame was concentrated, simplified, and buried. Yet fragments remained. Scattered writings, damaged ledgers, and private testimonies hidden in villas and archives reveal the truth Rome preferred to forget. The system had functioned because it was allowed to function. It thrived because silence was safer than resistance. In the years that followed, survivors returned to public life, carrying invisible scars that history would never record. Families rebuilt their names, never speaking of the cost. Children grew up sensing something broken in their households, but never learning its source. Rome continued to call itself civilized, lawful, and superior to all other cultures, while the memory of what it tolerated faded into shadow. This forgetting became its final crime. By choosing stability over truth, the empire ensured the lesson would remain incomplete. What makes this chapter of history so disturbing is not only the cruelty of one ruler, but the efficiency with which an entire society adjusted to it. There were laws. There were rituals. There were records. At every stage, someone nodded, signed, escorted, or looked away. The horror did not rely on constant violence. It relied on cooperation fear, and the human instinct to survive even at the cost of others. That is why the story endures, not as a tale of madness, but as a warning. When history labels such a period an aberration, it comforts the living. It suggests the danger is past. But the truth uncovered in ruins and manuscripts tells a darker story. Systems like this do not begin with monsters. They begin with excuses, with patience, with the belief that silence is temporary. Rome learned too late that once dignity is treated as property, anyone can lose it. And that is the final reflection left behind, carved not in marble, but in absence.